Some tips that I would keep in mind when setting up an aquarium are the weight load. A lot of people forget that water is very heavy, so they'll buy a 200 or 300 gallon tank and they'll stick it in their upstairs apartment and they wonder why the floor sags a little bit. So make sure that the weight of the aquarium is what your floor can handle. You also want to make sure you level the aquarium. A lot of people don't do that. They think it's just a piece of furniture, they could set it up on their floor as is. Well, glass panels do not like to be torqued. So if you have one corner that's off and the other one is off, it'll result in a lot of stress on that bottom panel, and that's how leaks occur. And when that crack happens, all the water is going to pour onto the floor, and water does a ton of damage. I would also waterproof the cabinet of the stand. Go to the hardware store and buy a piece of rubber, or go to a pond supply store and get a pond liner and just line the entire inside cabinet of your stand. If you have a canister filter or a wet dry filter or a refugium sump, this pond liner will help to trap the water. It creates a bathtub inside, well, a bathtub liner in the cabinet of your stand. You also don't want to overfeed your aquarium. That's how most problems occur. When you overfeed, it taxes the filtration system, stresses out the fish by creating a chemical environment that's not suitable for the fish. Your ammonia, your nitrites are going to be elevated a little bit. When the fish are stressed, their immune system is compromised, and that's when disease kicks in. So all of these problems, or a lot of these problems, can be avoided by not overfeeding and not overcrowding. Overcrowding results in stress to the fish, and when fish are stressed, their immune system's compromised, that's when they get diseases. So don't overcrowd. Make sure your tank is level. Make sure your floor can handle the weight. Don't overfeed, and always do regular maintenance. Weekly maintenance is the best. If you can devote a half an hour to your aquarium every week, you'll be much better than trying to devote 2 or 3 hours to fixing your problems once a month. And remember, at the end of the day, these are living animals, and they really deserve weekly attention for the filtration. To set up a saltwater aquarium, well, obviously you need an aquarium. You need the right life support for the types of animals that you're going to be keeping. Now, there's a fish-only system, and there's the living reef. That's something you want to decide in the very beginning, whether you're going to have crustaceans and invertebrates and live coral. That setup's going to be a little bit more involved than a typical fish-only system. I do recommend a living reef. It's a more balanced ecosystem, and I think you'll get a lot more joy out of it. And now with the technology and the equipment we have, you'll find it's a lot easier, in fact, probably just as easy to keep marine reef animals as it is to keep just a fish-only system. You're going to need a very strong stand. I do recommend buying the stand that complements whatever aquarium you're buying. If you try to do piecemeal and buy an aquarium and stick it on a piece of furniture you have to make sure that stand is strong enough to support the weight of the aquarium. Water weighs 8.3 pounds per gallon approximately, so a 100-gallon tank, you're up almost to a half a ton, 1,000 pounds. As far as filtration, there are many different types of filters. There's wet dry filters, canister filters, undergravel filters. All of them are great, and all of them serve a purpose in the type of aquarium that you're setting up. You definitely want to put the majority of money into your filtration if you're on a budget. Other types of filtration include protein skimmer. Protein skimmer is going to physically remove a lot of the dissolved organics in the aquarium. A lot of these organics would have to be broken down by bacteria, which would result in high nitrates in the end. So buying a protein skimmer will actually save you some money and save you some headaches by removing a lot of the waste from the water before they have a chance to get broken down. So I do recommend a protein skimmer. I'm not a big fan of the hang on the back protein skimmers, as a lot of them dump fine bubbles in the tank, and that can irritate the fish. It'll just stress them out, their eyes can pop out from it, and it also gives the tank water a cloudy appearance. So you want a good filtration system that is an overflow style. You want the water to be overflowing from the top of the tank into a designated overflow box, and that'll bring the water down into your base in the stand, where your wet dry filter or your reef sump is, and that is where your return pump, your carbon filtration, your protein skimmer, your biological filtration, all that stuff is housed below in the aquarium. As far as lighting, there are a lot of options. LED lights are great. Try to go with a lighting source that doesn't emit a lot of heat, so that hopefully you can avoid purchasing a chiller. But if you find that your water temperature runs too warm in the summer months, then you're going to need a chiller. You're going to need a heater too. So you're going to need a heater, chiller, protein skimmer, a good sump, preferably a wet dry filter, and that should be able to take care of most of your needs for saltwater aquariums. To set up a reef tank, you want to start with picking the largest size tank you can. Reef tanks have a lot of needs, and the more water you have, the more forgiving it'll be. You'll have less fluctuations in temperature, pH, calcium. It's just a larger body of water to resist change. And reef tanks, or the reef environment, is probably one of the most, or it is one of the most stable environments on Earth. So trying to replicate this stable environment is easier if you have a larger aquarium. The types of filtration that you would want include a typical reef sump, where you'd have the water overflowing from the top of your aquarium into an overflow box and then channeling through the reef sump and being pumped back into the aquarium. But while it's in the sump, you want that water to be filtered by a micron sock to get a lot of the particulates out of the water. Then you'd want a good protein skimmer to remove a lot of the waste that's dissolved in the water. Then you'd want some carbon in there to remove some of the impurities, the odors, the yellow stains in the water. And then you want a good pre-filter sponge to filter out a lot of the fine bubbles and some of the waste before it goes back up into the aquarium. If you have the room, you should also go with a chiller and a refugium. A refugium is going to add just a natural environment for copepods and amphipods to grow, which as they multiply will become a natural food source for the corals. It also allows macroalgae to grow, which will scavenge a lot of the nutrients out of the water, preventing undesirable algae from growing in the aquarium itself. A lot of people nowadays dose vodka into their aquariums, or they use a pellet or bio pellet reactor. And the theory behind this is to cultivate large colonies of bacteria, which also remove nitrates and phosphates, keeping the water as close to natural reef conditions as possible. All these types of filtration require a large footprint to keep them in. So if you have to pick and choose, I would recommend a good reef sump, a good protein skimmer. I would recommend a pellet reactor. If you have the room, you can go to a refugium. But if you have a good pellet reactor, then you usually don't need a refugium, as they are a little bit redundant. And then a chiller. You know, even if the tank temperature is operating at a normal temperature, all it takes is one afternoon or one night where that heater malfunction or the temperature hits 100 in the room because the air conditioner broke, and that temperature spikes and you could lose everything in the tank. So it's one of those things you'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Okay, to set up a fish tank protein skimmer, the obvious recommendation is to look at the instructions. I don't advise taking on the challenge of setting up a skimmer without having the instructions. That being said, the things that you want to keep in mind when setting up a protein skimmer is where the effluent release is on a skimmer. As most skimmers, even the best ones out there, always release fine bubbles back into the water. So if you have a hang-on protein skimmer, or if you're setting your skimmer on a shelf above the aquarium and letting the water dump back into the tank, you're going to have a problem with fine bubbles. That being said, I recommend going with an in-sump protein skimmer. They utilize much more efficient pumps, so you don't have the high electric needs and the high heat output that you would have associated with an external type skimmer that relies on pumping the water up into the skimmer. I also recommend that the skimmers sit inside the sump, and preferably in the beginning stage of the filter, so that all the fine bubbles get filtered out by the sponge and the pre-filters before they get pumped back up into the aquarium. But to set it up is very basic. Most of them only have a few parts. There's usually a main body, a pump, a few gaskets, an upper assembly that would be your collection reservoir. Sometimes they have a little spout that you'd stick your hose on to drain the waste, or the skimmate as it's called, to go into a collection cup. But all these skimmers nowadays are very easy and very straightforward to set up. To set up a goldfish tank, let me define tank. Most people, when they buy a goldfish or they win a goldfish at a carnival, it usually comes in a bowl. I think goldfish bowls are one of the top sellers at aquarium shops. So let's talk a little bit about bowls, and then let's talk about why it's better to get a tank versus a bowl. The bowls, to set them up, you'd just want to put one fish in a bowl. The bowl should be at least a gallon in size, preferably 2 gallons. Put a little bit of gravel in the bottom of the bowl so you add a lot of surface area for bacteria to grow. I also recommend buying a little bit of bacteria, a net, some food, some dechlorinators, and a pH test kit. Just because it's a goldfish in a bowl doesn't mean the rules that apply to aquarium keeping don't apply to a goldfish. It's a living thing and it has the same needs as tropical fish, just a slightly cooler temperature. So you set up the goldfish bowl, use water that's been filtered, or Poland Spring or Deer Park water, let it get to room temperature. The reason for using filtered water is that you don't have the gas that's associated with tap water. Remember, tap water is under pressure, and when the water's put in a bowl, you get all the bubbles that build up on the sides of the tank. Well, those gas bubbles are lethal to fish. So you want to let the water sit overnight if you're going to use tap water. You also don't want to shock the fish with water that's too cold or too warm. So it's best to take that water and let it sit and let it become room temperature for 4 to 5 hours. Overnight is even better before putting the fish in the bowl. The reason why you want to put one fish in the bowl is because oxygen is going to be very limited. Even though goldfish can scavenge oxygen or air from the surface, you don't want to overcrowd them. You want them to be able to get some of their air from the dissolved aqueous environment, as opposed to having to scavenge all the air from the surface. You also don't want to overcrowd it because you don't have a good filtration system on a bowl. So the bacteria that's growing in the gravel can only process so much waste. Do your water changes once a week. Don't overfeed. Feed the fish once a day, as much as it can eat in 5 minutes. What that means is you just put a little pinch of food in there. If it eats all of it, put another little pinch. If it eats all of it, keep doing that for 5 minutes. The goal is to not have one leftover flake at the bottom of that tank. If you have leftover food, you should take a net and scoop it out, because in a bowl it could result in cloudy water or water with a high ammonia level, which will actually burn the fish's skin. It's pretty nasty. For all these reasons, I recommend going with a tank. Try to be strong and don't go with that bowl. Get a 5 or a 10-gallon tank. Get a basic hang-on filter or an undergravel or an internal sponge filter. Anything instead of a bowl. You do want some type of moving filtration. It'll make the tank run so much better, and you could put a few goldfish in it. But just remember, the goldfish get big, so even a 10-gallon tank is going to be too small when that fish is 4, 5, 6 inches big. But to set it up, you don't typically need a heater for them. They do prefer colder water, so room temperature water is fine unless you live in a very cold area and it's in a cold room and you go away and there's no heat in the house. Then you'd want a heater in the aquarium, because you don't want the water to go from the 60s down to the 40s. That'll just stress the fish. So you need basic decorations, gravel in the tank. You don't need an aquarium light. You don't typically need a cover on the tank. Goldfish usually don't jump, but sometimes they do jump, so be prepared to find your fish on the floor. I know it sounds morbid, but that is a risk that you have with an open top aquarium. Also, if you have cats, as you know, cats love fish, they're attracted to them. So if you have a cat, you probably want to go with a strong, tight-fitting top to the aquarium. And those are the basic tips that you need for setting up a goldfish tank. To set up a freshwater aquarium, you're going to need your tank, your strong stand. Remember, water is very heavy, so you want to go with a designated aquarium stand. You don't want to just put a fish tank on a piece of furniture. I've heard nightmare stories where the stand collapses 3 months down the road. So you want to make sure the stand is very, very strong. And then for the filtration system, there are a lot of options. You can have a canister filter, which goes in the cabinet. I prefer a canister filter for freshwater aquariums. It's silent. The hoses run up the back of the aquarium. You can pack whatever you want inside the canister filter. If you have the luxury of going with a wet dry filter, like some people that had a saltwater aquarium and now they're modifying it to keep freshwater, you won't have any oxygen or very limited pH problems with a wet dry filter, because the water is being oxygenated constantly. It's a little bit more of an investment. The tank is going to be a little bit more expensive to allow for this type of filtration, but it's basically saltwater filtration applied to freshwater. For most freshwater aquariums, you want either a canister filter or a simple hang on the back filter, like the old Whisper filters, the Magnum filters. It just sits on the back of the aquarium, it oxygenates the water, filters the water. You're going to want an air pump, because the fish are going to need a lot of oxygen, and relying on the filter alone usually isn't enough. So you'd want a strong air pump. Put a check valve in the line so the water doesn't back siphon through the hose and flood the floor. You're going to want a good heater, preferably a fully submersible heater. Put it down a little bit low in the aquarium, so when you do water changes, you don't have to worry about having the top half of the filter exposed to the air. That temperature difference on the heater will crack the heater. So you want to make sure your heater is submerged very, very low in the aquarium. You also don't want to put your thermometer right next to it. You want to put it away from the heater, so you're picking up the true temperature of the water, not just the heated water next to the heater. As far as other things that you need to know to set up an aquarium, you're going to want a lot of decorations. The fish need to feel secure, but you don't want to do too much where it just traps a lot of detritus and waste. So just a good balance of decorations. I like to slope the gravel from the front to the back at a slight angle to, just visually, it makes the whole tank become in focus. If the gravel is flat, it just doesn't look as good. Also, stack the decorations from small to high. Put your high plants in the back. And finally, go with a nice background decoration. You can buy things that you could tape onto the back of the tank. I like to spray paint the tank. You use regular black or blue spray paint. Do it when the tank is empty. Do it outside and let it dry real well, and then you'll have a solid background that should last years. And that's it. Just have fun.